if you follow the railway, you may know that recently we had a new locomotive join our fleet for a couple of years, 53808. It's a 7F owned by the Somerset and Dorset Railway Trust, previously based at Washford. And it's now down here for a couple of years to earn some revenue in preparation for its next overhaul. Now, unsurprisingly, I have been flooded with requests to do an episode on it, which is what I'm going to do right now. But when I started researching this engine, I actually found out more than I thought, in the sense that this is a rare beast. There are only two left survivors, 808 and 809, and only 11 were actually built because they were a bespoke locomotive for the Somerset and Dorset route. Now, if you want to find out more about this engine in particular, the owners, the SDRT, they've just released a DVD which is currently available on their website. In this episode, we're going to touch on the 7Fs and also look at the broader picture from the Somerset and Dorset route. Its building, what it became, the 7Fs, and what's left. The Somerset and Dorset Railway was an amalgamation between two railways. The Somerset Central, which ran from Glastonbury to Highbridge and where it connected with the Bristol to Exeter route, and the Dorset Central, which at the time of opening in 1860 ran from Wimborne to Blandford. Both railways shared a common goal to make a cross-country link between the South Coast and the Bristol Channel, and their thinking really was pretty sound. South Wales, as it is today, was a big exporter of steel. But to get steel from South Wales to the South Coast, you had to take a perilous journey around Land's End. Whereas if you could just ship it from the South Coast across the Bristol Channel to Bristol, and then take the rest by rail, well then suddenly that journey became a lot shorter, and a lot safer as well. The two railways merged into what we call the Somerset and Dorset Railway, and in 1862 they completed their sections where they joined at Cole and they opened the route. However, there were a few issues. The first one was that the Somerset Central was built as broad gauge because it connected with the Bristol to Exeter route. And the board put a lot of pressure on the Somerset Central Railway. Now, both railways, they wanted to be standard gauge. They obviously saw what was coming. But the board of the Bristol Exeter route, they pushed for broad gauge. So the Somerset Central side, as far as Cole, was actually dual gauge. So, the rail link was opened. They managed to get as far as Templecombe. But the traffic never really appeared. Drastic action had to be taken. So they took it. In a last-ditch attempt to stave the line, they extended towards Bath. They managed it. The increase of traffic was substantial, but by the time they finished building, it was too late. The line went into receivership and got taken on by a merger or join between the London Midland and Scottish and the London and South Western to form the Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway. In 1910, the extension to Bournemouth was completed, and finally the line ran as a cross-country secondary main line from Bristol and Bath to Bournemouth. This became part of the Pines Express route, much loved by a number of rail enthusiasts that ran from Manchester to Bournemouth over the S&D. But because this route was built over the Mendip Hills and potentially on a budget, the gradients were steep, very steep, 1 in 50. Now we at the Watercress line, we say 1 in 60 is going over the Alps. 1 in 50, that's like going over Everest. So it needed a special locomotive, something built specifically for the S&D route, and this is where the 7Fs came into the story. The Somerset and Dorset line saw a variety of locomotives over the years.
ranging from Midland to Southern and eventually standards. In the early days of a new amalgamation between the Midland and London and South Western, the line's steep gradients were a big problem. The Midland Railway generally provided the coaching stock, with the responsibility for providing the locomotives shared between the two companies. But the 1 in 50 gradients of the line required power in excess of what was already available from the locomotives if they wanted to haul any sort of heavy train. One solution would be to double head, but to do this for every train would greatly reduce the number of trains you could run due to lack of motive power. The solution? Design a bespoke class of locomotive for the line. Two plans for 080 locomotives were suggested, but ultimately would have been too heavy for the line. James Clayton, the draftsman at Derby, was tasked with and given free rein to design the locomotive the Somerset and Dorset line desperately needed, and what he produced was unlike any other Derby-designed locomotive of the time. The 7F design used the G9AS boiler from the Midland compounds, with a Bell-pair firebox and Walschaerts valve gear. A leading pony truck was added to help distribute the weight of the locomotive, and the cylinders, which in turn powered small wheels to aid traction, were mounted high on the frame and sloped to avoid fouling the platforms along the route. The locomotive certainly proved to be a powerful addition to the line. However, as with all hills, getting to the top is one challenge, but maintaining control of your heavy train on the way down is even more vital. This was obviously thought of, as the class were fitted with 3 steam brake cylinders, as opposed to the usual 1 or 2 you could usually find on locomotives of this size. 2 were fitted to the engine, and the third worked the tender brakes, providing an exceptional amount of braking force. The first batch of 6 were built in 1914 by the Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway, with an additional 5 being ordered in 1925 from Robert Stephenson & Co. in Darlington. The second batch were originally built with a slightly larger boiler, but were all eventually converted and refitted with a smaller type in line with the rest of the class. The class proved to be very successful on the S&D and prompted the Midland Railway to experiment with their use on the East Midlands coal trains. Unfortunately, they were the right locomotives but for the wrong line, as the route did not utilise their design for climbing hills, with the class having issues with efficiency due to the large amount of coal being consumed. The decline of the S&D began in the 1950s, with branches being closed bit by bit. Between 1959 and 1964, all of the 7Fs were withdrawn and sent for scrapping. The last Pines Express ran on the 8th of September 1962, with Evening Star hauling the train. Eventually, the line was identified for closure in the Beeching Report, which formed the final nail in the coffin. The Somerset and Dorset Joint Railway closed on the 7th of March 1966. Towards the end of 1965, with the final day of regular passenger services over the Somerset and Dorset then set for the 1st of January 1966, a number of people met to ensure that that line would not be forgotten. Their purpose was to collect, collate and record as much as possible about the history of the line, and to encourage modelling. The name of the organisation was to be the Somerset and Dorset Circle, which eventually would change and would be known as the Somerset and Dorset Railway Trust. At their annual general meeting in 1968, it was proposed that the Circle should investigate the possibilities of preserving one of the 2 remaining S&D 7Fs that at the time were sitting in Barry Scrapyard awaiting the cutter's torch. It was also proposed that a museum should be set up in a former S&D station building to help tell the story of the line. A price of £2,500 was agreed between the Trust and the Wooden Brothers, and just like that, 53808 had been saved. After being based at Radstock for a few years, the Trust moved to Washford Station on the West Somerset Railway, where they would base their operations and museum, including a number of exhibits, ranging from buildings to rolling stock. From there the trust grew and developed, and in August 1987, after restoration by the West Somerset Railway, 53808 returned to steam. The Trust also acquired another locomotive in the form of 040 Peckett Kilmerston, which emerged in the exquisite SDJR Prussian blue-lined livery after overhaul in 2013. The achievements of the Trust over 50 years have undoubtedly fulfilled the objectives of that handful of enthusiasts who met to do something in 1965. The Somerset and Dorset Railway has not passed into oblivion. Both its memory and many physical artefacts live on.
It's still possible to walk some of the old network of the S&D. In fact, the section between Bath and Midford forms part of a two-tunnel cycle network. And it is really an awe-inspiring, if not interesting, experience. Along the tunnel we found art installations that play classical music to you, and it fills the tunnel with a true sense of ambience. And it really is an absolutely wonderful experience, and weird to think that at one point in history trains would be thundering up these tunnels on their way to Bath and Bournemouth. Unfortunately, in November 1929, one journey was more eventful. A train had stopped at Midford to let another train pass and was working hard at the tunnel. The engine was chucking out fumes, so much so that it overcame the driver and firemen. They collapsed on the footplate, leaving the train working hard all the way to the top of a hill. And then running down the hill towards Bath, it ran away, coming to a stand when it crashed into the goods siding just outside Bath station. 2 shunters and the driver were killed. I'm not sure what happened to the firemen, I couldn't find a note. I can only assume they survived. What a fate. But it really is an experience to walk through these tunnels. What a history. If you do get a chance, have a walk through Coombe Down Tunnel. It really is a strange and surreal experience, especially with the art installations there. You can also see the soot on the roof of the tunnel from the locomotives as they powered up the steep gradients. Interestingly, the engine that was involved in the accident I mentioned was another 7F, 53809, which is now preserved and actually visited the Watercress line a few years ago. Now, I couldn't find an appropriate place to put it in the narrative, but I want to mention Templecombe Station. It was south towards the Bournemouth end of the line, and it featured a unique arrangement, as illustrated by this. Now granted, it is taken from Wikipedia, but it is public domain and it does show the problem quite nicely. The line crossed the London and South Western that ran between Salisbury and Exeter, and it featured a unique arrangement. You had the Salisbury Exeter station at the higher end, occasionally called Templecombe Upper, and the Somerset and Dorset station below it. Through traffic was important to the railway, especially those coming from London towards Glastonbury and Highbridge. And they weren't too happy with the idea of their passengers walking about half a mile. So they had to do something about it. Initially they started doing a shuttle, where the train would run from the S&D station out to the East side and into Templecombe Upper, and that became ridiculous pretty quickly. They then decided to join the two stations, so you'd have a spur to the west, the eastern one just got turned into sidings, and the trains would come in and serve the station. All well and good, except for one problem. No matter whether your train was going northbound or southbound, at some point to serve Templecombe, it would have to reverse, and propelling a passenger train, i.e. going backwards, is not a good thing, not for long distances anyway. So they had to do something. Initially, you'd have an engine there as a pilot locomotive which would attach onto the back. Let's say a northbound train was coming in, it would go up to the junction, pilot train would come onto the back, pull it into the station, couple off, and then once that train had done its stuff on the platform, it could go on its merry way, and the reverse would happen for a southbound train. Interestingly, at some points in the timetable, a northbound and a southbound were planned to meet. The southbound would come in, wait on the curve, northbound would go up to the junction, back onto it, and the southbound would pull everything into the platform. Both trains would do their thing. The northbound will pull everything out, they cut off at the junction and go on their merry way. This system seemed to work. It was the best of the bad situation. And then they decided the S&D platform just wasn't really needed, so they took that away and replaced it with a smaller one which had very little facilities and only saw a couple of trains a day. So yeah, honourable mention to an interesting arrangement. Now, as you can see, you can actually still walk upon parts of the S&D, and you'd think it's all doom and gloom. This is a completely lost line. But it's not all despair, for there is one section where you can still get on a train. Here at Midsummer Norton, the Somerset and Dorset Railway Heritage Trust have done a beautiful job of restoring the old station and also part of the old S&D. And I was fortunate enough to speak to Stephen about the line and also what there is to see. Stephen, thank you so much for having us here. So when did this all begin? How did the trust come to be what it is today?
The Trust first got hold of Midsummer Norton Station back in 1995. Midsummer Norton Station was quite unique with the stations on the northern part of the line, whereas it never actually entered into a residential property, as it were, but was commercial from the actual day the railways left. It's part of a college system, and luckily when it came up for lease and rent, we had some foresighted people who said, right, let's get hold of it. Within the first couple of months, restoration was underway, and people just said, right, we'll put some track down, maybe get a carriage there, and we'll just preserve the station. As with all these things, it manifested itself into a bigger project, and over time we actually had working steam locomotives visit the line. We got both tracks laid, we've extended up, and now we're at a point we've just got just under a mile's worth of track, and we're operating on most weekends.
Wow, such a history. So when people come down here, what is there to do when they come down?
Well, one of the things you've got is our working signal box. The signal box was rebuilt complete from scratch. When we moved in on the site, there was literally just a hole where the actual signal box was, but a lot of the original brickwork and stonework had been pushed in there. So we had a lot of teams meticulously pull the stonework out and, like a jigsaw puzzle, rebuilt the signal box to the actual fine state that it is today. Additionally, we've got a fantastic museum which is based in our old stable block, and we've got a lot of vintage rolling stock which dates from the 1950s, which we're adding to all the time to actually give the real feel of Somerset and Dorset again.
You mentioned a museum. Can we be cheeky and go and have a look?
Let's go up now.
Brilliant. Quick detour before we actually get to the museum. I've got to show you this because it's absolutely mind-blowing. With me is Mike. He's the operations manager here at Midsummer Norton. Mike, thank you for taking your time out of your lunch break, I'm going to be honest.
Fine.
So what's actually under this shell? Because it doesn't look like any sort of steam engine I've ever seen before.
Like a diesel, doesn't it?
Yes.
So here we have is a Sentinel steam engine. This was built in 1927 at Shrewsbury by Sentinel at the time. This led to two being built and used up at Radstock in 1928. So this is a prototype engine before the Sentinels were made and used up at Radstock Colliery. So going over the engine, completely different to a conventional steam locomotive. So first we have the cab, which has the boiler inside it. So it's a vertical boiler instead of a conventional sort of steam engine where it's horizontal. So it's got, instead of normal tubes, the hot gas is going through the tubes and heating up the water around it. So the tubes are all filled with water and they crisscross over the fire. So the boiler sort of runs at 275 psi.
Wow.
So it's quite
I was
high.
thinking because Bullies originally ran at 280 and then we got taken down to 250.
That's
so
right,
that's insane.
And that's a big boiler, and that's not just all in the cab. That's along the whole length of the engine. All the boiler, every single bit of it is inside the cab. So that's all there. That's all in the cab, and then that drives two engines at the front of the locomotive here. And as I walk up, you've got the boiler in the cab. You've got this space here for all the water. And then the space at the front, you've got two engines. So each engine has two cylinders. So technically it's a 4-cylinder engine, believe it or not. And this is a balanced single gear locomotive, and it's driven by chains onto the driving wheels. So that's the simplest sort of.
So you've got a bit of bullied in there with chain drive as well.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. It's a beast of its own, really. It doesn't go very fast, but it was built to pull sort of heavy trains very slowly, but it could do it. It was built for shunting and moving heavy trains around. And the one thing that struck me when I first came onto this locomotive is, like I said, the whole boiler is in the cab, and it's got no injectors, unlike a conventional steam engine.
So how do you get water in the boiler then?
So each engine, as I said, the two engines at the front, each engine has a pump which pumps water in. You've got the bypass valve on the driver's side, which is operated by the driver, so good communication between the fireman and the driver as we're going along. So as we're moving, we can pump water in, and as we are running passenger service here, we're always pumping water in on the way up to the end of the line. When the engine is stationary and it's in steam, there is a steam-operated pump inside the cab, which is loud, but it does a good job, and that you can turn it on, and that pumps water into the boiler from the tank here.
Fair enough. So were any of these actually featured on the S&D?
Yes, so not this type. This, as I said, this is a prototype, built in 1927. But they ordered two Sentinels in 1928, and these were used up at Bradstock Colliery. They were slight modifications. The most different changes, just the square windows. There wasn't in much changes that I know of mechanically. There probably was more different changes and so on. But yeah, it's pretty much this. This was the first one of those that came at Bradstock. So this is the first.
Wonderful bit of engineering. Thank you so much, Michael. And where were we? Back to the museum.
Okay. Here we are in the museum of the Somerset and Dorset Railway Heritage Trust. It's currently based in the stable block of the station at Midsummer Norton. Some of the more interesting items we've got is the original number plates from the smoke box of 34006 Bude, which was used on the LCGB rail tour on the 5th of March back in 1966. We've also got an original timer, a sand time, which came out of Radstock North signal box. It was used by signalmen to time trains, so when the train passed their box, he would turn it over and start the timer. If he hadn't heard from the box in the allotted time, there would be a slight panic that something had happened to the train en route.
Stephen, thank you so much again for showing us around here and in the museum, and I shall leave you to it.
No, thank you, Will. We obviously look forward to seeing you down again soon.
So there you are, proof that you can still get a train up the S&D, and well worth a visit if you're ever down that way. When you think about it, there's actually quite a few similarities between the S&D and the Watercress line. Both were built as secondary main lines, which went from one main line to another, rather than branch lines which sort of came off and then went to the middle of nowhere and stopped. They also had really big hills, but granted the S&D does pip us to the posts very slightly. If I've got my timing right, this video will be released just as Bahamas pulls onto the train at Rockley, ready to take it on to the next section up to Alton. This gala is paying homage to the Pines Express, which used to run on this very route going from Manchester down to Bournemouth, and interestingly was hauled at times by Jubilees. They take the train from the north and get cut off at Bath, ready for another train to take the next section. Fantastic bits of kit, they really are. So there you are. The S&D is quite a complicated history, and that was just a brief overview. It's quite a fascinating one. If you look it up, there's plenty of books and materials to read online. I strongly recommend you do so. It really is a fascinating story. Now, for those interested in the 7F, the owners of it have just released a DVD about the life of the 7F, a bit of its history, including recent stuff, including moving to the Watercress line. So, well worth a look at that. Apart from that, all we can say is thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to the guys at Midsummer Norton for having me. And thank you once again to the wonderful people at B&R Video Productions, who have kindly let us access their treasure trove of footage looking at this old line. And their DVDs are on sale in the shop when we can eventually reopen them. And if you ever do find yourself in Somerset, take an extra few hours to experience the history of the Somerset and Dorset route. What a beautiful place.